Hello, this is the webinar edition of the Design Thinking Ghana Hub's monthly meetup, April 3rd. The topic is Design Thinking Emergency Situations. This is a voiceover PowerPoint narration because we got Zoom bombed when we tried to do it on Zoom yesterday. So we decided to do a voiceover PowerPoint narration to be able to get the content out. You'll notice that Design Thinking Ghana is 5 years old this year. So you see our badge at the bottom left as well. I'm Dr. Gordon Adomdza. I'm going to do a quick intro of myself and then move forward. So I'm the co-founder of Design Thinking Ghana Hub and also an associate professor at Ashesi University here in Ghana. I lead Ashesi Design Lab and I hold a visiting position at CEIBS Africa, where I help with executive education. And prior to that, I was on faculty at Northeastern University and also was able to do some adjunct work at Harvard Extension. Two experiences that have shaped the way I look at education today. One is encountering design thinking at Continuum Innovation. At the time it was called Design Continuum. This is 2009 in West Newton, right out of Boston. And also doing some work with Mass Challenge, one of the largest accelerator programs on the planet. These two experiences have been great because now I describe myself as looking at the design thinking process at the front end of the entrepreneurial process, right? So using design thinking to develop new products and new business models. So both for entrepreneurs and also for companies. The world has temporarily closed. This is the situation we find ourselves in. We are all aware of the coronavirus and the impact it's having on all of us, the global economy. And so we thought to use this prompt to talk about how design thinking can be applied in emergency situations, because we often hear our workshop participants say, this process is so long, I don't know how I can apply it in a short period of time. So that's why we're using this prompt. And we're looking at two main areas of emergencies, if you will. So two, if you will, situations within a broader emergency situation. So one is we can see something happening, but we don't understand it, right? So we can see the virus, we can see the lockdowns, but we don't know how long it's going to take. We don't know what it means. In Ghana, for instance, this is our first week of the lockdown. We're going to our second week. What will happen after that? You don't know. You get the president has to figure out whether to close the borders or to quarantine people and so forth. Very fast evolving situation when you're trying to understand what's going on. Your workers are at home, and maybe you don't know what productivity looks like. Before the lockdown, you had a bet on people doing orders from home, but then nobody is making orders, right? So there are so many different kinds of so many scenarios within emergency situations, and one of the ones we want to focus on is when something is happening and you don't understand it, and we're saying design thinking can be very helpful here. The second situation is when you have some understanding but you don't know what to do next, right? And that's what is going to confront us in maybe weeks and months to come. What happens next? What happens when coronavirus lets down and we're back to maybe some functioning of life? What will happen? Should you close down as a business? Should you move half of your staff online? Should you change your customer segments? Should you go into a new kind of business? Should you only focus on cash flow positive kinds of business? So many questions here to be answered. And so the argument we're making is that for the first one, design thinking uses abductive logic in reasoning, and therefore it works very well when you can see something happening but you don't understand it. The second point is that design thinking evolves around the concept of the point of view, which is what you normally really need when you don't know what to do next. You have to create a point of view. And so these are the two arguments we're making in this presentation as to how design thinking is useful in emergency situations. So let's get started. If you are new to design thinking, this is a really good visual for you. Think of the two ends of this diagram: problem, solution. And in the middle, you have something called definition or point of view. The idea here is that design thinking is a problem-solving approach. All problem-solving approaches are also research approaches. Research approaches will have research in the front end, analysis in the following that, and then some kind of decision at the end. So you can think of the process of discovering being that of research, defining being analyzing, and then developing being ideating on what the potential solutions could be, and delivering being prototyping to get to the right solution. So you have these divergence, convergence, divergence, convergence flow to the process. Tim Brown, who's one of the proponents of design thinking, defines it as such: a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. The main point to note here is designer's toolkit, because you know how to do research. You've done this before, even if you're not trained in research. What is different here is that we're borrowing from the designer's toolkit, and we're also focusing on people before we go to what technology can do, right? So we start with humans, and then we try to and once we have a deep understanding, we can go to the ends of the world to bring the most suitable, best technology to fulfill that need for the customer. So those are the things to note, to keep in mind. I also have my own definition over years of doing this work in this space, and I define it as a problem-solving approach that is user-centered. Extremely important to be user-centered. Takes a systems approach, a perspective. So in this case, you're not only focused on the user, but stakeholders around the user. Have you solved a problem, come back and realize that it still exists because you didn't look at the space around the problem? So you need a systems perspective, and when you do it right, it often leads to creative outcomes. It's extremely important to keep the point of creative outcomes in mind, because if you're doing this at the company level, the more design thinking projects you do, you have to realize that you also have to start implementing some of them. You can't keep on coming up with creative ideas when you don't have a system in place to sort them, to evaluate them, and put them in practice. So that's extremely important. User-centered, systems perspective, and what to do with creativity when you develop. Design thinking emergency situations. Number one, our first prompt: we can see something happening, but we don't understand it, right? So if you take it to the coronavirus, you see dry cough, fever, difficulty in breathing, but you don't understand why it's taking the toll that it's taking, and why it's making the impact that it's making, because these things are common. You've seen them before. They are usual, if you will, with most viruses and bacteria. The point here is that in this kind of situation, what we do use is logic, right? We do have to reason it out. And so I'm taking a step back to theory a little bit. If you're not a theory person, please bear with me just a few more minutes. So what is logic? It's a process of reasoning using existing knowledge to draw conclusions, make predictions, and construct explanations. There are three methods of reasoning, and they are deductive, inductive, and abductive. So we're going to make the point that generally design thinking works more with abductive logic. And then we're going to go to why abductive logic is probably best suited for emergency situations, and therefore design thinking is probably also most suited for emergency situations. So what does deductive approach mean? There's a social phenomenon happening, and then you develop a theory to explain what has occurred. You go and collect data to either accept, reject, or revise the theory, right? So that's deductive logic. You go and collect a lot of data, and then you say it is true that this theory, when people encounter this happens. Now, inductive logic, you observe a social phenomena, you collect data on possible reasons. So someone like collecting cases, and you're looking for trends, so you can construct theory out of those trends to explain the social phenomena. So that's inductive. Abductive, you have a social phenomena that you're observing. You take several hypotheses based on observations, and you pick the one that best explains the scenario or the phenomena, and then you go and test that one, right? So note here, you pick the one that best explains the phenomena, and then you go and test it. So if you take this back to coronavirus, you realize that in the heat of the moment, deductive approach is when you say, we can't do this, we need to go do clinical trials on whatever, or we need to collect data from 1,000 patients before we can make a decision, right? Inductive will say, well, let's look at clusters of patients, maybe let's look at age, maybe let's look at geographic location, maybe let's look at some other factors, and then we can construct the theory about what's going on. Then abductive will say, let's look at the potential alternative plausible explanations, let's pick one and run with it, because we need action in this moment, right? Not long talk, if you will. So you realize that abductive, yes, when you pick a hypothesis and run with, you could be wrong, but remember the word test, because you're testing it, and if you're learning from the test, then even when you're wrong, you can correct very, very quickly. So this is another view of that. Inductive, generalize existing ideas. Deductive, narrow them down. And abductive, combine the two so you can create space to generate new ideas. Let me push this concept a little bit further. If you're not a theory person, just bear with me, just very quickly. So you can express it as this, right? Logic, you have a precondition, a rule, and a conclusion, right? All birds all swans are white. That bird looks white, and therefore it could be a swan, something like that, right? You've encountered something like that before. So you have a general rule, you have a precondition, and then you have a conclusion. What's happening with the three types of logic is that the deduction affirms the conclusion, induction affirms the rule, and abduction affirms the precondition. So let's work through a few examples, right? So rain, right? Rule, when it rains, the grass gets wet. Conclusion, the grass gets wet. The precondition is rain. Now you observe that the grass is wet, but it hasn't rained. So what do? You need to affirm the precondition and look at what might have caused the grass to be wet. You're observing, you know that viral and bacteria, this is another example, the rule, viral and bacteria infections can lead to people's lungs to collapse, right? But oftentimes they recover from it. That's a general rule. Conclusion, people very normally recover from these kinds of infections, but you're observing something different. People are dying from these kinds of symptoms, right? And so then you have to come to the precondition and try to understand what kind of viral infection or bacterial infection is this. And then you probe a little bit further and you realize that it's something called coronavirus, right? Or let's bring it home to a scenario where for the lockdown, the president made the announcement and said motorbikes cannot carry a person. That's the rule, right? So that means that motorbikes are allowed, they cannot carry people. You say, ooh, that means they can carry goods. All right, so we can do a lot of deliveries during the lockdown. So motorbikes can carry goods, and therefore it will lead to a lot of deliveries. As a conclusion, right? You start launching, the lockdown happens, people are not making orders, right? So you go back and you look at the precondition, what's causing the rule not to be true and the conclusion not happening, and you realize, ooh, most of the bike riders are from the north, because that's where people, that's where you have bikes are more prevalent in the north, right? And because of the 2-week lockdown, most of them left. So most bikes are parked. And so that rule will not work, and you will not realize the conclusion, right? Or you take another case which says The rule is when people are in lockdown at home, they will make more online purchases, right? So what it means is that you can make a lot of online sales. Well, it's not happening. You're not making online sales. People are home, but they're not making purchases. What is causing this to happen, right? That's often the case in an emergency situation. You observe a conclusion, you observe the rule being broken, but you don't understand what's going on. What is causing this phenomena to happen, to go on? So you probe a little bit further and you realize, well, people got notice of the lockdown and therefore they prepared. They stocked up, so they don't need deliveries. Right? So you basically did not consider potential preconditions, alternative or plausible explanations in making the decision to stock up on something that you think people will need. And so even though you used the rule and you predicted a conclusion, you didn't think of the precondition, right? So what we're saying here is that when you are in this kind of situation where you have a conclusion that you're observing in a rule, it's not the time to go and do large scale research using deduction to show whether the conclusion is true, or the time to go take multiple cases so that you can build theory in the way you do induction to try to make a decision. You need to resort to abduction, where you explore alternative potential hypotheses about basically exploring the precondition to see what is going on. And then when you find one hypothesis that seems to fit, you probe on it a little bit more. Let's look at this in an example, right? So you say, again, back to the viral infection. It's a viral infection, viral bacterial infection that has these symptoms will often, normally people recover. In rare cases, they die, right? So what you observe people dying, you realize that they have these symptoms. What's potentially going on? Right, so you explore a little bit further and you realize, ooh, it's some kind of unusual pneumonia, right? Very, very weird pneumonia that's going on, and you trace it back to a viral, a very different kind of virus. So if I lost you, that's fine. Let's take this other angle that will probably be helpful. So this is a good diagram to think to summarize the three types of logic in reasoning, and also trying to understand what's going on by doing through research, if you will. So we see that design thinking is in the middle, right? So deduction, you're waiting for 100% reliability, but you don't have the time. Induction on the right is mostly about validity, right? But abduction is 50-50 mix. So you're playing in the middle, testing different models to see which one works. So that's a really good visual to keep in mind about what design thinking is and why it falls between these two types of logic. And the other point we're making is that in emergency situations, abduction makes more sense. If you think about it, that's what doctors use to make sense of emergency situations. That's what the Chinese doctor who blew the whistle on the virus, that what he basically used abduction. He didn't wait for deduction to get 100% reliability. He didn't do induction so much. He was a 50-50 sort of split, and he quickly used abduction to say, this looks like SARS, right? And therefore we need to be careful, because if it's SARS that's coming back, then it's going to be very deadly. Now, another view of it, or this is also in closing on the concept of what design thinking is and why it's useful here. This T-shaped model is basically the idea of what kind of mindset do you need for abductive logic, right? What kind of mindset do you need to be successful as a design thinker in applying abductive logic? And David Kelly says that we need to produce T-shaped thinkers. That means combining analytical thinking, the vertical on the leg of the T, and horizontal thinking, intuition, experimentation, and empathetic. So the idea here is that for far too long, we've been trained on using our analytical sense in analyzing problems and making sense of what is going on. But to be a successful abductive thinker, if you will, that you also have to apply empathy. Now, we're not saying empathy because you're born with it. We're talking about empathy as a process. So design thinking does a really good job in providing you with a lot of tools for empathy. In fact, the whole ethnographic research process in design thinking is an empathetic, it's for empathy, right? To do a good job in operationalizing empathy. So you need to apply empathy. Empathy is not a science, right? So you need to be comfortable applying intuition in making sense of which of these hypotheses best fits the scenario that we're looking at that we don't understand. Now, you're not going to get it right the first time. So you remember abductive logic, you have to do tests, experimentation. So you need to have this experimentational or prototypical mindset to the way you solve problems, right? Be very confident in choosing an alternative, a plausible hypothesis to focus on, but then be sure to test and be sure to revise your stance and your decisions when you get new information. And if you do this well and you become a really good T-shaped thinker, you would be a good abductive logic processor, if you will, and therefore what it means is that you can do design thinking really well, and according to our connections here, that you probably will also be very good at handling emergency situations, because you're not waiting for 100% reliability or focusing on 100% validity. You are doing a 50-50 mix. And the argument we're making here also is that when McKinsey put out this model for how to respond to COVID-19 by setting up a nerve center, as described this in this article, responding to coronavirus, the minimum viable nerve center, what they were describing, we think, is what it's abductive, a setup to more quickly use abductive logic to make sense of the COVID-19 situation, right? So they developed this nerve center concept, which combines people from customer engagement, from supply chain, from workforce protection, from financial stress testing, and so forth, pulling them together into this nerve center at the top, right? The top. And they said they said something that we thought was very interesting, right? An unfamiliar crisis, the nerve center concentrates crucial leadership skills and organizational capabilities and gives leaders the best chance of getting ahead of events rather than reacting to them, right? So we think what's happening here is abductive. Right? They're bringing them together. They're looking at what potential scenarios, potential hypotheses rather, and picking the one that quickly defines and describes what's going on, and then they go out and test it. Now, note that the words they use here: discover, decide, design, deliver. We put the design thinking model to it, and you can see some similarities here, right? Discover, design, deliver, lessons from the past. So we think there are some commonalities here, and this is, if you will, support of how design thinking is useful in emergency situations as outlined by this model that McKinsey put out. Now, a quick note to make, right, is that they titled it the minimum viable nerve center, and the point they were making is that when you put this number of people together, it can get very complicated and it can get very slow. So what you do is that you pull out the core people, right, and pull them into a minimum viable nerve center. So the smallest number of people you can put together representing all of these different areas, so that you can be very quick and rapid in your decision making. So what will be our conclusion for the question number one, or scenario number one? You can see something happening but you don't understand it. What we're saying is that design thinking uses abductive logic, and therefore it's very, very useful, and that when you take the T-shaped thinking approach, that you'll be more likely quite successful in using this approach. So one thing to know. So here are our conclusions. Number one, focus on a user group or people group to empathize with, right? In an emergency situation, it should typically be the people who are impacted the most. It could be your consumers, it could be your employees, it could be your suppliers, it could be your delivery people. Focus on them, because it just makes the decisions and everything more pointed and easier to wrap your head around. Don't wait for hard evidence, right? That's not the time to do deductive. So come to the middle and use design thinking. Go with your hunch. Be very comfortable using abductive intuition if there's something like that. Not conspiracy theories, right? But abductive intuition to identify plausible hypotheses to go forward with, right? And definitely test, test, test. Make sure that you are testing, make sure that you are involving core stakeholders in testing, and make sure that you're being very open in communication, right? Because the more open you are with communication with your stakeholders, the easier and quicker it is that you get feedback and be able to update the decisions that you're taking as a result of the emergency situation that you're evolving, that you're trying to understand, right? And so in this case, it could also be just involving your stakeholders in order to understand the problem a little bit more, so that you can say, this is what we think the problem is. Okay, so now let's go to the second question. We have some understanding, but what do we do next? We have some understanding of the problem, but what do we do next? And I just want to prime this with, we're doing a lot of reference to McKinsey articles because we find them very intriguing. An article, another one from McKinsey, I think he's the global managing partner, Kevin Snyder, who said, we are not going back to the normal that we had before coronavirus, right? That's what everybody is thinking about. And some people are saying, well, maybe we just know. Some consumer preferences are changing, consumer behaviors are changing, employee behaviors are changing. Most stakeholders in the economy are having different perspectives about how we go back. So clearly, this is something that we need to be thinking about, that we may not be going back to the normal. So what does that mean? It often means, I'm going to make the point, that it means that we need to figure out how we make decisions. We need to figure out how we think ahead, even though we don't understand what's going to happen next. And design thinking is really good at helping us do this. Now, take your mind back to when the virus started spreading and ravaging, right? Very quickly, you started hearing the concept of flattening the curve. Flatten the curve, as you can see in the blue curve, right? The idea being that healthcare systems will not be able to deal with very high rates of infections. So what we need to do is to reduce the rate of infections to the limit of healthcare systems, so that we can survive, right? So flatten the curve, you heard that multiple times, and that's where social distancing came from, and that's where the concept of stay at home came from. So like you can see here, there's a really nice picture from BBC that, it's a really good picture of social distancing. And then we also had the 5 things you should do, wash your hands and so forth, right? All of that to flatten the curve. But it's often also the answer to the question of, we have an understanding of the virus, what do we do next, right? So flattening the curve is what we do next. Now, what is that? It's a point of view. It is a point of view, right? It is a point of view that you latch onto, and then you start strategizing around. So the point of view was that we need to flatten the curve. How do we flatten the curve? Stay at home, do quarantines, and so forth, right? So point of views are extremely important, especially when you cannot collect large mountains of data to use the measures of central tendency to do computations, look for the mean and 2 standard deviations around the mean and so forth, right? When you can't do any of that, you need a strong point of view, which is almost as strong as a mean with 2 standard deviations around it, so that you can use that for decision making. And design thinking does a really good job in helping us develop a point of view. So going back to these diagrams that I've shown you before, normally when you do the T-shaped thinking, when you try to understand what's going on, you create a point of view out of that. And the point of view is also what you get in the middle of the process, where you define what's going on, right? A good thing is that the point of view has a formula. It is user plus need plus insight. All right. So this is a quick overview of how we explain it or understand it in design thinking. You could think of it in these 3 buckets. users. Why? So that you be very, very specific about who you are pointing, or who you need to design for, right? Who do you need to design for? Users. So that focus helps you in understanding what you need to do when it comes to the users. And then needs, what do they need, right? And then surprising insight, what do you need to pay attention for to when you are providing the need. So the insight is not the need, but it is what qualifies the need. Let's look at an example. So in this example, we're looking at an adult person who lives in a city as the user. What do they need? They need a car to use for 10 to 60-minute rides 1 to 4 times per week. What is the insight? The user should not want to own his own car, as it will be too expensive compared to his needs. He would like to share a car with others who have similar needs. However, there is no easy and affordable solution for him. It is important for the user to think and live green, to not own more than he truly needs. So what the point here is that the insight qualifies the need. Now, you can come up with a car or a solution that allows the need to be true, which is 10 to 60-minute rides 1 to 4 times per week. But it needs to also make the user feel, first of all, the user does not want to own the solution. That's number one. 2, they want to feel like they're living green. That's also important, right? So if your solution does not take into consideration the insight, right, but fulfills the need, it will not be enough, right? It will not be enough, because it needs to fulfill the need qualified by the insight. So these three, if you will, segments of a point of view are extremely important, but what they also do is that they give us really strong direction in what we must do next. In fact, at the company level, what we have found is that when you engage employees or managers in the design thinking process and they come together and create a point of view, it leads to a high level of alignment across the various departments. When it comes to implementation, no department is fighting with any department, because it's very clear to them what must be done and for who and how. So point of views are extremely important in the design thinking process, and we're going to make the argument that when you don't know what's going to happen next, a point of view can be very, very instructive. But let's look at another view of it, right? So you describe your user, use adjectives, you name the needs, and then you identify the insights. All right, so this is a good model to keep in mind as well if you want to probe a little further. Now, another example. So in this example has to do with premature babies and the ineffectiveness of the current design of a baby incubator, as you can see in this picture, right? So let's explore a potential point of view statement for redesigning that baby incubator. A desperate mother in rural area needs a baby warming device to save her baby when she lives in a community where there is a low cultural acceptance for separating mothers from premature babies, right? So who's the user? Desperate mother in a rural area. What is her need? A baby warming device. What is the insight? She lives in a community where when you give birth, you are not expected to be separated from your baby, right? So a traditional incubator where you put the baby in, where the mother can go home, is not acceptable in this community. So very clearly, 2 things stand out for us, right, as potential solutions to this point of view. Number 1 is that the solution should make sure that the baby and mother are all together, all at the beginning stages, right? So it can be 2 ways. 1, the solution should make sure that the baby is carried with the mother wherever the mother goes, or that the solution is such that the mother is able to stay with the baby when the baby is in a stationary position in an incubator, right? So you can think of an incubator with a bed for the mother or something like that. Now, here's the solution. It's called Embrace. So it is a baby warming device, but it satisfies the insight, which is that the mother can carry it around, right? So point of views are extremely important. The insight is extremely important. I just want to probe a little bit more. In this case, I love this diagram of for staying at home, right? Because what it means is that um, if you do social distancing, but it doesn't lead for you removing yourself from the potential of you continuing to be the connection that transfers this virus to other people, then it doesn't really um, meet the objective, right? So even though you are staying at home, you also need to make sure that if you experience symptoms, then you isolate yourself, for instance, because otherwise it doesn't fulfill the solution of flattening the curve. So the insight is extremely important in qualifying the need. Now, with all that, how let's take a quick look at a few diagrams. I just want to show you this and come back to how we can use a point of view in looking at what to do next, right? So the virus has spread around the world despite containment efforts. There's a lot of containment efforts, but it's still spreading. Um, all of these are from the McKinsey readings that we've been using, right? These are the stages, so we have a really good understanding. We have a good sense of what the economic impact and indicators are going to be. As it goes to stage 5, we see what social activities will also be as it moves from stage to stage, and you can come back and scrutinize this diagram a little bit more. It's making an impact on supply chains around the world, right? um, in one of the articles they said it used to be that it didn't matter where things were produced in the world. Now we're realizing that where things are produced matters, right? And where you get your supplies from matters. Like in Ghana, for instance, I think it was the president was saying, "Oh, we realize we don't produce anything." Right, so then we have to rely on other countries to be able to import things, and in an emergency situation, it becomes really hard. So you can see how the supply chain, global supply chain, has been disrupted, and it really points or begs the question, what's gonna happen next once the virus subsides? There was this other diagram that I thought was really good. It talked about potential losers and potential winners from the economics of COVID. And again, you can come back and scrutinize this a little bit more. There's another one on some of the indicators that were tracked in China. Again, I just want to point these out very quickly so you come back and look at it. The number of COVID cases in Africa, what do you see? Mostly in the north and in the south. And it looks like it's not spreading as quickly in the west, not spreading as quickly in the east either, right? So very interesting. What does it mean? We need to think about all of these when we make decisions going forward. There's another focus on the impact of the economic impact on Africa based on 4 scenarios, right? And the scenarios had to do with whether the virus is contained or not, and whether the so the global transmission and Africa transmission, and what happens. And then this one talked about GDP growth in those 4 cases. So, but then the point was that GDP was going to decline by between 3 to 8 percentage points, right? So most areas of the economy are going to be affected. And this other one was also on what the governments need to do, right? So here it talks about setting up nerve centers and having proactive communication, securing food supply, and so forth. What does all of this mean to you, knowing that we are not going back to normal? What does it all mean to you? What is your point of view? Where are you situating your point of view? Is it around your customers? Is it around your employees? Is it around your assets? Is it around your core value, or what business you're in? Is it around your stakeholders, your suppliers, and so forth? How do you make sense of all of this? And how do you know what to do next? So what I want to do now is to draw a connection between the concept of the point of view and the concept of emergency situations and the characteristics of emergency situations, if you will, using another concept that I want to introduce very quickly, and then make the argument that design thinking it's very useful here. So the concept I want to introduce here is the concept of VUCA. Now, this is a Harvard Business Review article from about 2014 that focused on this concept of VUCA. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And the point they were making was that business leaders of tomorrow needed to know how to deal with these factors in sort of day to day, right? Now, very quick sort of, a little bit of focus on each of these factors. So volatile, the nature of the dynamics of change and the nature of the speed of change, forces and change catalysts, right? Uncertainty, the lack of predictability, the prospect for surprise and the sense of awareness and understanding of issues and events. C, complexity, the multiplex of forces and the confounding issues, the no cause and effect chain and the confusion that surrounds the organization. Ambiguity, the haziness of reality and the potential for misreads and the mixed meanings of conditions, cause and effect confusion. Does any of this resonate? Don't these explain the situation we're in right now, trying to make sense of tomorrow, right? So the point here is that there is sort of a model for understanding and making sense of this kind of situation. In fact, the US military started using this term of VUCA when it started the Iraq-Afghan war, because that was the first time they could not use conventional warfare to fight the enemy. It was the first time they couldn't even figure out where the enemy was or how they attacked and so forth, right? It was a completely different war. And General George Casey, who was a commander who actually led forces in Iraq and so forth, says is that to succeed in a VUCA world, we must expend energy in the areas that produce the highest payoff for our organizations. Our first priority must be developing and articulating a clear vision to drive our organization's actions. Does that sound like a point of view? Our first priority should be developing and articulating a clear vision to drive our organizations. We think this is what a point of view is, right? So the idea being that in a VUCA world, which is where we see ourselves right now, we need a point of view, right? We need a point of view that will lead us and move us forward. Now, learning from military strategy for business, it's not new. I mean, you hear terms like conquer the market, defend our market share, and so forth. We have always learned from military strategy over time to be successful in business strategy. In fact, there have also been work connecting design thinking to VUCA. Like, for instance, in this article, I'm just going to show you very quickly, and this one, and even some academic work in the Academy of Strategic Management Journal, which starts to link design thinking to VUCA environments, and this one as well in Emerald Insights. So what's going on looking at VUCA in design thinking? Basically, if you look at complexity, volatility, ambiguity, and uncertainty in a 2x2 matrix, for instance, it helps you make sense of what's going on, right? By looking at if something increases, how much do you know about the situation? And then on the y-axis, how well can you predict the outcomes of your actions, right? So this matrix is really good in helping you make sense of the scenario to know what to do next. So you can come back and scrutinize it a little bit more. But the general idea here is that when you use the VUCA approach, a few things that it does in shaping you and the organization's capacity, you as an entrepreneur and if you lead an organization. One, anticipate the issues that shape the situation that you're in, right? What should you do next? Understand the consequences of the issues and actions. Appreciate the interdependence of variables, how you treat your employees, how you treat your customers, right? The fact that both your customers and employees are at home right now. So there's a connection there. What does it mean? Prepare for alternative realities and challenges. What if things don't go back to normal? What are the other things we should be doing? How do we reconfigure our assets to continue producing something if we are not able to go back to the business we used to do? And how do we add on new business areas to what we used to do? Prepare and then interpret and address relevant opportunities. If there are opportunities that are showing up, how should we look at them? On what basis? The idea here is that if you take the VUCA angle, it helps you do this. And it's also the case that design thinking is very helpful in going through these 5 or 6 elements, if you will. Why? Because design thinking is best in straightening out a scenario, right? What we do in design thinking is we reframe problems, we explore them using abductive logic, which we've talked about, and in that process of picking hypotheses and different hypotheses that may explain what's going on, hypotheses about how maybe people who are good at motor riding are back in the north, and therefore that's why we are seeing difficulty in doing deliveries. Well, maybe we need to quickly train motor riders. I don't know, right? After all, there are no cars on the roads, right? So motor riding should be a lot easier for people who are not really good at it, So we need to look at, don't go do that though, but we need to, design thinking does a really good job in helping us make sense of these potential opportunities. It's also great in helping us focus on users to design for and to solve problems for. I like this analogy of being able to strap neuroreceptors on your users and download what they feel and think and want to do and their aspirations so that you can design for them. Of course, you can't do this, and even if you could, it will be unethical. But it's a really good analogy, right? And when we understand users really well, we profile and characterize them, right? Looking at demographics, psychographics, and so forth, so that we can better relate to them and we can better create strong point of views that will help us design solutions that blow their minds. And we are also very visual. So we use a lot of visualization in making sense of the situation we're in. So, in problem space mapping, you can use tree diagrams, for instance, as you can see there, to map the causes and effects. The causes at the bottom, the effects at the top. Children are malnourished. What are the different causes? You think of the roots of the tree as the causes. We do a lot of unpacking of problem situations in journey maps. Oftentimes, if you do not unpack the problem situation, it's really hard for you to see the gaps, right? Unpack how your customers experience your value proposition and see how you may be able to change things post-COVID. Unpack the way you engage with your employees and see how perhaps you can build in online work as part of their work routine to maybe cut costs, to improve on productivity, and so forth, right? Unpack the way you relate to your suppliers and your distributors and see how where the holes are so that you can plug them more easily. If you sit around and talk about them, especially now that you can only talk about things over the phone, it's a lot harder to be able to see gaps. You see gaps when you unpack. And then, of course, also taking emotive modeling to customer journeys, right? So looking at situations that are often positive and situations that are often negative, so that this is the diagram on the bottom right, so that you can be in the business of moving up the negative scenarios. If you are in an industry where customers often have a negative experience at a particular point, maybe the way they understanding of credit, or maybe how they commute to a particular place. In the industry, everybody has this problem. Then maybe you can look at moving this negative experience that customers often have and make it a positive experience and differentiate yourself from the rest of the providers in the industry. But it often works well if you unpack it into a journey map and you put emotive modeling, positive and negative, to it to identify typical negative experiences and typical positive experiences to focus on. Design thinking is also great in coming up with new ideas. What you see there is the 9 dot puzzle, and it goes with this instruction. Use 4 straight lines to connect the dots without lifting the pen. What people normally do is that they try to connect all the dots in an imaginary box. Remember that the instruction does not mention the word box, right? But people will spend hours trying to connect all of these dots, um, using trying to connect all of these dots using 4 straight lines. And then when you show them the solution, which involves moving the pen outside of this imaginary box, then voila, um, the puzzle is solved. And the point here is that oftentimes when people are confronted with a problem, they create an imaginary box of boundaries around the problem, and they decide that the problem should be solved in these imaginary boundaries, right? Because of experience, maybe because of what has happened in the industry for a long time, and what they need to do is to be able to step outside of this imaginary box so that they can literally draw 4 straight lines, right? um, it's very interesting because even if you've done the 9 dot puzzle before, it is still hard. And it's a really good sort of reminder that we cannot focus on our biases now in moving forward from now. We have to not draw imaginary boxes to capture us and only process in these boxes. We need to be able to move out of these imaginary boxes and think about new ways of business post COVID. All right. So in all of this, design thinking is helpful, if you will, if you go back and look at all of those slides. But the point here is that we need speed. We need speed. We need to do it very quickly. We do not have time. We need to plan now. And what our suggestion is that 2 things: bring experts and users together to create your point of view, right? Don't create a point of view with only your employees, your senior staff, right? You know a lot of customers, you know a lot of people in your value chain. Bring them together and explore new ideas of how you reconfigure assets. Look at what Casapreco has been able to do, making rubbing alcohol, making sanitizers. It's the same process, right? So why not extend it to something that's needed? Reconfiguring assets, perhaps changing your customer segment, perhaps changing the way you connect with your employees. But don't make this decision in isolation of other stakeholders that could be involved. You'll be surprised what you learn from your users as you think of new ideas. You'll be surprised what you learn from your suppliers and your delivery people as you think of new ideas. So in terms of our recommendations for what you do next, when you have a good understanding of how this COVID is going to play out, or when we do know when it's actually going to end or taper off, right? One, bring experts and users together to create a point of view. Test a point of view elements with more stakeholders if you can. This may not be possible, but every decision is a set of assumptions. So test those different aspects of it with potential stakeholders you have now, for feedback, and start implementing a minimum viable product. Right? Start implementing the simplest version, not a replication of the idea you want to have, but start testing the assumptions, right, in its simplicity today, and definitely co-create with these users and stakeholders, and make sure that you're learning from the process. In fact, just yesterday, McKinsey put out another article and the title was "Getting Ahead of the Next Stage of the Coronavirus," right? Getting ahead of the next stage of the coronavirus crisis, which very much is what everybody's trying to figure out, and that's also the second question we're asking, right? What to do next? And they came up with a number of different options. One of the things they identified was that you come up with what they call a plan ahead team. So you can have a team that's doing crisis management right now, but you need a plan ahead team, right? And for us, that basically is putting some experts and users together to think about tomorrow. So not, focus on what you're doing today, but form a small team to think about tomorrow. And maybe it's just you are a sole, entrepreneur. Well, partition your thinking, think about the crisis now, but also do some planning ahead, right? And try to sort of work on certain scenarios, but more importantly, have a point of view. Have a point of view. So, very quickly to go to the closing, for the 2 pointers or prompts that we came up with. One, we can see something happening, but we don't understand it. What we're saying is that abductive logic is really good, right? Playing in the middle of deductive and inductive, and having this mindset that, yes, don't throw away the analytical, but have empathy as a process. It is not a science. Use intuition to guide you. Don't stop there because you are not likely to get it right the first time. Be experimental. Test. Ask people about the concepts that you're coming up with so that you can have a better understanding of what's going on. Two, you have some understanding. What do you do next? Generate a strong point of view, and don't do it in isolation. Bring people together, set up a plan ahead team, make sure you mix the different people, because you'll be surprised at how different people with different experiences can be very useful in coming up with new ideas. It's not a surprise that car manufacturers were being called on to develop ventilators, right? They are not in the medical device field, but they are, because they have a domain expertise, they are encountering a new experience, and together with doctors, they can come up with ventilator concepts, right? So make sure that you vary the people that you're working with to come up with the plans for tomorrow. But and more importantly, make sure you have a strong point of view in moving forward. I want to end with the quote from General Kessie again. To succeed in a VUCA world, like the one we see ourselves in, we must expend energy in the areas that produce the highest payout for our organizations. Our first priority, must be developing and articulating a clear vision to drive our organization's actions. We hope that you benefited from this. Definitely follow us on these handles on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and feel free to drop me an email or connect on WhatsApp. We hope this was useful, and we hope that we can continue the conversation. We think we're going to be doing a live session which will probe on some of these concepts once people have had the chance to explore the content and digest it a little bit more. Thank you.